Hey everybody, welcome to the Slick Tree Podcast. I'm your host, Colby Langford. The point of this show is to help improve ourselves as dogmen and to raise the quality of the dogs on the end of our lead. So let's settle in, turn the volume up, and let's see if we can't learn a trick or two together from our guests.
He was probably 6.5, 7 months old. He's a May puppy. So, he was just kind of ready to go that coon season and started out, doing pretty good. He was hunting with his mother, Roxy, a little bit here and there and some by himself. We were treating some coon. He got probably, 2-3 weeks in, he was treating about a coon a night, and he was always catching them. Right. I mean, my dad probably for the first year and a half of his life really didn't like Joe as much as I liked Joe, because a lot of times we'd hunt together. Joe would end up catching coon, 400 or 500 yards, 600 yards from you, and time you got there, he'd already been done with it and was back to you, so you wasn't getting those. And with this season, with him being so young, I was pleased with the progress he was making for sure. I mean, like I said, about every night he was treating coon, getting it. Well, probably mid-December, it got pretty cold, and I mean, we got an ice storm and some snow on top of it. And of course, anybody that knew me, especially at that time, it didn't matter. I just always hunted, but the coon getting was a whole lot less. And I mean, we'd win night here, night there, and without getting anything. And probably 3-4 nights, with him not treating anything. The Roxy female had treated a couple, but I mean, he just really hadn't found anything to get going. He started treating possums. And it's funny because, he hadn't treated a possum to that point. And the first night, I just petted him, sent him on, and it kind of like that the next night, treated another possum. The coon still dealing. And we probably went, probably 3-4 weeks with having that snow ice mix. And it was just, into low single digits or teen weather. We normally don't get that type of weather for very long here. But I mean, after a while, I was like, what am I doing? I just, he's 6-7 months old, so I just started knocking the possums out to him. And long story short, probably he's seen 100 plus possums that year. And I mean, it just was one thing after another. When the snow melted off and everything got better, he went back treating coons again, petted him up, just rocked on. And, for his whole life, never treated probably, 2 or 3 possums the rest of his life. But always the funniest part about that story is the following year, Burke Schuster and myself, we was out hunting, and Joe treated a couple coon, and we're sitting there, and a couple young hounds came in with us. Well, we just stuck around till them guys got there and got telling stories a little bit, and he was telling me that how well his hound was doing, and he said he's been so impressed that they hadn't treated a possum all year. And I just told him, I said, well, you're welcome. And that guy looked at me real weird, and Burke, he just laughed and laughed because he knew, what I meant. Joe had deleted the possum out of the area. It was easier at the time to treat you than little Joe.
Yeah.
But Joe taught me a lot, and that was one. A lot of people are so afraid to, show them a possum or whatever, and these dogs are smart, and they figured out pretty quick. And I mean, even that young of age, when weather got back to treating coon, he wanted to treat coon. The possums wasn't a big deal to him. But like I said, he went Moses' life, never hardly treated a possum. Said you count on one hand, and he lived till probably 14. He was born around 2002, and I think it's 2016 when he finally gave it up. But like I said, old Joe was a good old dog.
He sure was. I can remember hunting with him. But hey, everybody! Today you are listening to the Slick Tree Podcast. I'm your host Colby Langford, and this is another installment of the Good Old Dog series. Today we are here with Nick Clark, a longtime friend of mine, and we are talking about Clark's one-eyed, two-toed Joe. Did I get that right, or did I get them two mixed up?
No, he's definitely a two-toed Joe, but like I said, talking about his one eye, Joe lost that eye, the use of that eye probably at 2. We was hunting up in Iowa, and the coon up there, the smallest coon I think we treed was 21, 22 pounds, and got one that they caught on the ground that ended up measuring from nose to tail 48 inches. But that was the eye incident with Joe. Joe had hold of it, another dog pulled it away, then let go and ran, and it got a hold of Joe right in the face and damaged that eye. And we spent weeks doctored and treatment, and he could see shadows out of it, but like I said, he definitely lost the use out of that eye and ended up, kind of having a rough year because he'd always tilt his head down when he was fighting anything. But you wouldn't know how he hunted and how he went, but he had basically one eye. So
Yeah, just so that everybody's got a little background between us. I met Nick in it was probably about 2010ish, maybe 2011. Nick was hosting the NKC Youth World Hunts over by Columbia, Missouri, and I brought my Dixie dog over there and ended up having some kids hunt her for a couple different years, and that was how I got to know Nick. And we ended up going to Jamestown one year together, and I'd come over and hunt with him on occasion in the wintertime. But no, Joe was a nice dog. Did you squirrel hunt him much, or was he just mostly a coon dog?
So, it was always presumed that Joe would never tree a coon, but that wasn't true. But the answer to that, no, I didn't hunt him too much on squirrel hunts. At the time had a half sister to him called the Super Freak. Mm-hmm. And when she was 9 months old, we'd won the world squirrel hunt with her, and she was just an absolute beast in the woods and the squirrel woods. And being at the same age, and kind of their hunt styles and stuff like that, I had at the time a young dog that was super nice to take to the woods in the day. And Joe, his motor and just kind of how he hunted, his hunt style was kind of more coon. And you kind of, my preference anyways. If I had a choice to do one or the other, I'm going to coon hunt. But I'd hunt him some, during the day. Where I hunted him the most in the daytime, we'd go up to these competition hunts and up to Iowa and wherever. And at the time, our 2 oldest kids used to go with us quite a bit, and my nephew, and they always wanted to hunt. And so I'd let them hunt Super Freak or one of the better squirrel dogs. And a lot of times I'd hunt Joe.
Gotcha.
And, Joe, like I said, I'm not going to tell you he was ever a world beater squirrel dog, because I just never really pushed him on that. I didn't want him for that, but he would definitely tree squirrels. And he's placed in several squirrel hunts over the years and stuff, but his variety was definitely coon. He was a true top end coon dog. And like I said, I'd always, you always hear people tell you that, you talk more about a dog after they're gone better. And I probably don't give him justice in how I talk to him. That anybody that's hunted with him for a few nights understands that he was 100% a coon dog, and the accuracy and the brains and, everything.
How did you end up with Joe? Where was he bred at?
I raised Joe. Joe, I had the female called Clark's Roxy that went back to my grandpa's, line of breeding and Uncle Teddy's. She's out of the Campbell's Ring and Tulip, and Tulip was out of Pistol Pete and Moon Girl, and then the Ring went back to Mountain Susie and Busher Sam and Kimmer's Old Rough, and she was kind of a saddleback female. She was super nice. I mean, probably pretty wise, built wise for a female. I mean, she was super nice. And then my parents owned Junior Jukebox, which Jukebox was out of Jukebox and Simple Pleasure Dolly. So, went back to Alan Franklin's Thunder. And, I mean, we had a lot of good breeding in there, and, the Queen was in there. But I raised Joe here. He was a litter of 4 and out of the Roxy female. But yeah, he was born and raised here.
Tell us a little bit about how you like to start dogs and how you started Joe, as far as just different methods you used.
So for me, and still today, the easiest way to start a dog is to hunt. I mean, just to go. And, at that time, it had Roxy, then I had a female called Ramblin' Rosie, which that was the Super Freaks female. And so I didn't have a ton of dogs, and Roxy was a fairly good coon dog, fairly decent squirrel dog. Ramblin' Rosie, to me, she was, you don't see it very often anymore. And what I kind of strive for was she definitely, you hunted her in the daytime, and she kind of, hunted squirrel, kind of high-headed fast and shorter loops, 200, 250 yard circles. And then at night, after you hunted her 2 or 3 nights, she'd, kind of slow down a little bit. She'd get out 500, 600 yards, 700 yards. And so that's kind of what I started him with. But I'm a fan of the coon cage. I'm a fan of that to a minimum. But, to me, just taking them, a lot of people tell you to start a dog by themselves, and I'm not disagreeing with that at all. But a lot of people, including myself, when you take a 5, 6, 7-month-old puppy and you're just taking walks in the woods, sometimes, you got to wait till something lucky happens. And, so to add in that environment with another dog that is doing it. And, Joe, like I said, both Joe and Freak, they were anomalies on the fact that, it didn't take much to get them started. I mean, when I took Joe out, Joe just went, he was a circle loop dog, but at 6, 7 months old, it was 600, 700 yard circles.
Uh-huh.
I mean, that dog covered ground deal. The Roxy female, and Joe kind of carried this trait of her. They didn't run. A lot of times you see these guys are snapping these dogs, and this dog is running just full speed. And, I don't know if I'm a fan of that. I want a dog to go. But, to me, the Roxy and Joe had that. They just had a pace. I mean, I always thought it was funny, you'd cut them loose, and they'd make that 500, 600 yard loop over and over again. But like if you had a younger dog with them, that first loop, that pup may be with them. The second loop, they're a little bit behind it. By the third loop, and, you watch the pup and stuff, and it looks like they're running. And, Joe and them are just jogging. But they could hold that pace for so long. And, Joe was by far the quickest conditioning dog. You could put him up for, 3 or 4 months, hunting for 2 or 3 days, and it's like you hunted him for a year. He got in condition so fast, but he didn't do a lot of things that wore itself out. But to me, starting a dog, time is probably the biggest factor, which, older we get, the harder it seems to find that. Back when I had them, it seems like I had a lot more time than I do today, or put more time to it. But there's not a book, right? I mean, that's the thing about each dog. Every dog's different. To me, starting a dog on squirrel or coon or whatever, I've always been one, don't limit your hunting. Don't pick one. If you got time to go out at night, go. If you got time to do the day, when you there's already enough excuses to not get in the woods. So if you give yourself more, it's going to do less for your dog. And, like I said, with Freak, it kind of made it a little easier because I wasn't trying to do as much. At the time, I had one that started so fast on squirrel and one that wanted to be a coon dog or, acted like it for sure. So it was a little bit more time to spend, a little bit more direction on that. And I'm a big fan of the combination. I liked, and I still today like to haul one dog, compete in it all. And, at that time, I just had two of them that, one was extremely good quick on squirrels and one was a coon dog. But I mean, that's kind of the take on, starting. There's not a magic, trick to it except, time and put them in the woods and give them the opportunities. And, if you leave them on the chain, one of my, stories on this, think about how much time it takes and stuff like that, where, I remembered one of my friends, Everett, had sold a pup to a guy over in Indiana, and we was at the Illinois hunt, and this pup was probably, 6-7 months old, and he came to me and asked if we would buy it back, and which I told him, I said, sure, what's the deal? And he told me he just wasn't interested in nothing. And I kind of asked him what he was doing, and he told me he was, spent tons and tons of time, working with this dog. And, every Sunday after church, he took it to an hour to the park, and it never showed interest in the squirrel. And I asked him, I said, so you're spending tons of time, which is an hour a week at the park? And he goes, yes. He said, a lot of time. I've been doing that. Yeah. So, the thing too, with everybody's thought on how much time, that guy truly believed that he was putting a lot of time into that dog, which, I mean, you've been into dogs long enough, and I have too. That dog didn't even get its pin energy out in that amount of time a week. So, and, luckily, like I said, with Joe and Freak, I did. And for most of my life with coon season, I've enjoyed it enough that, I mean, very few nights that I miss. I mean, even today with coons, without being anything, I still try to go every night. Back then, I hunted every night. And I mean, to me, what makes a dog is wearing them boots out for sure.
Mm-hmm. So what would you say whenever Joe was in his prime? Uh, you mentioned that he would run loops like that, but how would you expect a hunt to go? And would you normally hunt him with other dogs? Which I know that you mostly pleasure hunted, like you were saying, hunting every night. But what would a normal hunt look like from the time you cut dogs loose in the woods? Are you casting them? Are you walking them? Uh,
So Joe was one of the few coon, cur dogs for sure that I had. I had a few others. I'm a walk hunter. I don't even, trust me, there's nights that, it's misting and snow and cold that, yeah, I wouldn't mind a road hunt a little bit and stuff like that. But I'm a walk hunter, and it's more me than the dogs. But Joe was one that he would go, Joe was unique. The same with Roxy. His mother was like this. Joe would go, that first loop was going to be 500-600 yards. When you cut him loose, no matter if you dumped him by himself or dumped him with 5 dogs, he was the most consistent style of hunter that I ever had. But you cut him loose, he'd make that first 5 or 6. If you didn't move, he would always kind of look, kind of come in. He never very often came all the way to you. He came to you, but if you didn't move, didn't do nothing, didn't give him a direction to go, he'd just make that same loop, but it'd be 800-900 yards. I mean, if you kept standing there, Joe would go a mile, but he did it. And, Joe was easy to handle because if you came in, when he checked in, if you was going down this way, then he kind of always kept his loops in front of you. Like I said, he was easy to hunt. He kind of went directional of you. And He didn't normally waste too much time coming in and out once he knew where you was at. Yeah, his mother, Roxy, was the same way, all the time. That's back, we had the beep beep tracking systems that you couldn't carry, right? And all the, probably for that first 2-3 weeks, I hunted her. I always thought she just ran off and was gone, because the only time you ever seen her is if she treed. And one night we was kind of in a spot hunting some field pines and stuff like that. So I carried it, and basically she'd come in 150 yards, but when she knew where you was at, she just went away. She never wasted that extra energy coming in. And Joe kind of was the same way on that. He just made loops, stayed with you. Like I said, if you turned left and started walking that way, when he checked in, he just looped out in front of you. But yeah, like I said, with him, we hunted him with, at that time, I was lucky enough, my buddy Everett Hurley was hunting a lot. I had the Hurley's Kermit dog, and then Eddie Stevens, became friends with Eddie up north, and that's kind of where we had all the Missouri State hunts and the stuff like that at. And I mean, we'd go up there. I'd, bring a couple. Everett would have a dog. Eddie would have a couple. And, everybody always said that, they were worried about dogs being mean. And I just never seen these dogs. Like I said, we'd throw 5 male dogs in the dog box and go hunt, and never had problems in the woods. But yeah, to me, Joe was by far, if you could duplicate his hunt style, especially at night, because he didn't run off. He was a true loop dog. I mean, when you watch the Garmin, he'd cut out to the right, go out and circle back around and come back in left. And to me, those that I've had like that has always been, they cover so much ground. When a dog goes a mile straight up in front of you, probably covers less ground than that circle loop dog. And for me, wanting to walk hunt, I mean, again, I could go where I wanted to and get where I wanted to be. So,
What's his mouth like?
So Joe had a big bark, but probably the only thing that he's ever criticized his, whole life was his tree style. But he was the dog that taught me really what I wanted in tree style. Because Joe was, he had a big roar bark, and he kind of had a double type of deal when he barked. But Joe barked 40 to 45 barks a minute on a tree. And I mean, you could hear him. You never had to stop and wait. You didn't have to find out where he's at. He barked enough. And I've done with hound guys and stuff like that. And I mean, he'd tree, 6-7 coon, and their dog would tree nothing. And all they talked about is how he wasn't a hard tree dog. And, and the thing is, he wasn't. But I never kind of understood that for a long time. I was like, man, that's crazy. Again, your dog don't tree any. Mine trees the coon, stays there, barks the whole time, has the coon every time, and you're unimpressed. And the thing is, he sat right at the tree and just treat. I mean, like I said, it was, to me, later on in life, I mean, he was the dog that taught me if I could duplicate that part of it, I would have it 100 times. The super freak, they couldn't even count her in a treeing contest. I mean, she tripled crop root, but I mean, it was ungodly. I mean, how much he barked. The half brother that Bubba shot the jukebox and my dad had was, a super nice coon dog too. Barked probably 85 to 100 barks a minute. I mean, just was definitely tree style, right? On the tree, just blowing the top out.
Mm-hmm.
But, just kind of going to reference, Bubba shot the jukebox and Joe, quality of coon dog, they're probably close. But where Joe, to me, was 10 times better is, like Dad and I, we used to go up north and hunt a lot. We'd just go up there and camp for a week and coon hunt and do it. we'd go up like that. And at the time, we'd hunt basically dark to dawn, for 5, 6, 7 nights. And by the third, fourth night, them dogs wouldn't get out of the box. Joe acted like he done things for the first time. Like I said, Joe he didn't waste energy. He was as consistent. Like I said, you didn't see him running. You didn't do it. He had that pace, and it just seemed like it was kind of like that runner jogger pace. It's something he can go forever. Treeing, Bubba and them would be, especially on a little warmer night, would be slobbered mouth, couldn't hardly breathe, looking for water. Joe, he was good to go. And, I want a dog that trees good, that you can hear, that you don't have to go look for. But I'm okay with a dog that doesn't give me tree style points.
Mm-hmm.
I want an accurate dog that doesn't, and that's where Joe, that's what he was. He was a solid tree dog. Like I said, he didn't miss. I think a lot of times, if he couldn't mess with something, he didn't waste too much time with it. He just went and found something that he did. I remember one of the nights that you and I hunted, we went with Roy Williams, head down towards Ashland, and we treed a handful of coon and stuff like that. But we came across the pond, and all the dogs, it was a pretty good race. And, they ran it, probably 400 or 500 yards, and they ended up treeing in a corner post woven wire fence with a little bushy tree on it. You remember this hunt?
I'm not quite with you yet.
All right. Well, it was where when all the other dogs are there except Joe.
Mm-hmm.
And Joe went all the way across the
now.
pasture, and there was, 10, 12 huge pin oak trees, probably 600, 700 yards across the pasture. And when we got all the dogs, which where they was at, that coon 100% went up that post, went into that tree and out the other side, having the woven wire. And, like I said, where Joe was always for sure of himself. And like I said, and that was one of them nights where he, kind of proved it. He just did that over and over again. And, like I said, with him, he didn't miss the creeks. To me, he was probably the smartest, even young dog. A lot of young dogs, they get hung up in the creek and they waller and waller. I used to watch Joe all the time. He'd get to that crack, all the other dogs would be milling. You just see Joe go down the bank, go for a little ways, bail across water, come back to bank. Joe was smart enough. Instead of trying to track it, he just found where it came out.
Mm-hmm.
And I was going to say, there's them type of things. He had a brain that's good to go along with it, and just a different type of brain. But yeah, I was going to say, again, his tree style, though, if he was going to knock him, which to me, I still didn't knock it because he just treed coon, but that's probably with the most I hear, was about that.
Yeah, and you can definitely. I've seen a lot of dogs that I love the way they tree, and but you can sit there and watch them wear themselves out, especially if it's warm. They can't just sit there and hammer when it's warm and it not affect them. You pull them off tree and they'll be half worn out just from treeing, not from hunting so much. But like I said, I still like a hard tree dog.
Yeah. Well, again, I'm not going to knock it either. They're always impressive. Like I said, with the freak and, all them dogs that, when they get on the tree like that and hammer, there's no doubt it's impressive. But, if you're going out for an hour or 2 hours and going home, then dogs will do. If you're going to hunt all night, after night, you'll have to take a break because your dog won't get out of the box. That's what it proved to me. So like I said, because probably prior to Joe, if you'd have asked me if I wanted a dog like that, I'd have told you no. After having him, I liked it probably more because there was tons of nights we'd go hunt with everybody, everybody else's dogs are hanging around, walking with us done, and and he's just still out there treeing coon.
Hmm. Talking about how smart he was. I believe I remember you recalling a story to me on one of the nights we were hunting. But you had said that something he got to where he would do at one point in life quite a bit was he'd go in and get treed a long ways off. Well, you this was back when hides were worth quite a bit still. Uh, but you'd go in, knock the coon out, and while you'd send the dogs on, and he would backtrack back from where he'd been and tree two or three more. Like if they'd been a group of three coons running in a
Yeah,
group.
yeah,
He,
always. I mean, like I said, that was and there's several cur dogs that are a little bit more like that, but a lot of them, I mean, like I said, his brain just worked a little bit different to understood that a lot of times if there's one, there's another one.
mm-hmm.
And, a lot of the dogs that I've owned, you can turn them loose and stuff, but they'll pedal around and stuff. And, I've had some that does a good job treating that, but he always, you kick him loose and let him go. And, probably, one of my, again, wish we kind of had the iPhones and the stuff, the pictures and all the stuff we did. But Corey Cummins and myself, it snowed. I mean, we probably had, a foot of snow, and it got warm the next day, and, it probably melted the first, 4 inches off. But it cooled down real quick again that night. Was in, probably in the 20s. And Corey called and asked me if I was going, and which of course I told him. I said I'm going. He said that he wanted to, so we met up, and there's a horse farm that we always hunted, and we went out there, and I mean, it was probably the most miserable hunt I ever went on, because the ice on top of the snow, the melt, you
Mm-hmm.
could put your foot on it, step up, and you could lift your foot up off the ground, and then you'd fall through. And that was like that every step. It would hold you, on your other foot. So, I mean, the jarring and the walking was extremely crazy. And even Corey, he goes, there is no way we're treating anything. And Joe went down through there. We ended up killing 11 coons that night.
Yeah.
But the thing that, kind of always impressed me on that one is we got 5 or 6 coon. And I back then we carried a lot. And so, but I told him, I said, dude, we got to stop and skin. And Corey agreed. And so we was doing that. Well, Joe had left when I threw my coon coat on, and probably, at the first couple coon, Joe came back in and laid curled up on my coat and went to sleep. And, Corey looked at me and goes, what do you think that means? And I was like, I said, he knows we ain't coming. I was like, he figured he might as well come rest, I guess. It's the first time I ever seen him do that, and we got the coon skin, and, I told him to get up the coat. And before I got my coat on, he was treed probably 400 yards from us with a coon.
Huh.
And to this day, I believe he had already treed that coon. He knew exactly. I mean, it was 10 seconds. I mean, when he got up, he was treed. And I told Corey, I believe that dog's just smart enough that he went and found a coon, knew we weren't coming to him. So he just came back and hung out. And when we was ready to go, he just went and treed the coon.
Huh.
And, that was with Joe. I used to, which I think you probably remember, I always kept track forever of every night we went coon hunting. And my goal was for a long time, and my stuff ended up getting ruined, so I never did it. But I was trying to see if there was ever a pattern, if there's more, certain times of the day, certain times of the night, certain early, late, was there more sows, was there more boards, did, moon phases really affect you, and stuff like that, which
Mm-hmm.
the thing that I learned is, if I was stupid enough to be out in the woods, a lot of times there was a coon, as stupid as I was, but there was, a couple hours in the night that it seemed like that you treed more coon. And there was a couple that was light. It didn't mean that you didn't trim. It just, if you took a year, you may tree 100 of them within this one and then 15 within this hour that year.
Mm-hmm.
And, at the time we was hunting long enough hours, that, we was getting pretty good records and the stuff like that. But Joe, when I got done doing that, when I quit kind of doing that, he'd treat over 3,000 coon.
Mm. That's a lot of
Like I
coon.
said, Joe was a coon dog.
Yeah. What was you kind of touched on it earlier, but could you go a little deeper into kind of what style nose he had, as far as like more of a winding or more tracky nose, or?
So with Joe, kind of stating back at the beginning, Joe was one of those dogs that he wanted to catch game, wanted to get game. And I always think that's what made him accurate. You never seen him wind, but you never seen him just grind the dirt out either. He was kind of that mid-range track, his head kind of medium high. And like I said, you never seen him pace. He didn't. To me, his brain, like I said, worked different. If he got on a track that he really had struggled with, probably needed, he could probably drag it out and push and stuff. He just hunted bigger, right? He found the track to where he could push it. And I think it's probably a rarity in a lot of the dogs that I've owned over the years is, I've had some that's been extremely well of winding and pushing that type track to another one that really grinds the track out and can figure some harder stuff out. And, for the longest time, always believed that Joe was, maybe just always finding the easy carrier. But again, anybody that can test, that hunted with him, you could hunt him with some pretty good dogs, and he was the only one treating coons. So they couldn't be the easiest coons. Mm-hmm. But he was unique on that. Like I said, because to me, the Roxy female, his mother, was a lot like that. You just didn't see him just grinding a track out. They just kind of had that pace, that middle head high type of movement, and you'd never seen him stand up. The Bonnie Betty female, was one that she'd stand up in the middle of a cornfield and run straight and get treed. And, my banner dog now kind of does both. He's kind of he can wind or he can really drag a track, but Joe, like I said, he just, when he moved a track, it didn't take him too long to tree it. And, he would go as long as ways, but like I said, you just didn't see him ever stand up and win, and you really never seen him just really push a track either.
Yeah. What when he was in his prime and you pulled him out of the dog box, what would you be sitting there looking at? Just describe him as far as his conformation, his ear set, his head shape, just his overall appearance. Tell me what he'd look like.
So to me, Joe was a specimen. It was one where, he was a buckskin blue. He had a small stripe down his face. When he was in good shape, probably pushing right 60 pounds, he was heavily muscled. Like I said, Joe, you could put your hand sideways in between his front legs. He was just a big, broad, wasn't a real tall, real long dog. He was kind of funny, but, had a nice square head on him. His ears, a lot of people for the size dog said they were a little too big, but again, if you folded them over, they went barely past the corner of his eye. He had a good ear set, where they sat on his head. They kind of broke a little bit. But like I said, to me, when he was cleaned up, that buckskin blue, I've always liked that color. It shined, and, the amount of muscling that dog would have was ungodly. I always said if you was into cattle and wanted double muscling, you'd breed the Joe, right? That was his thing. Joe, again, won the bench show, everywhere. I mean, he was a grand bench in a couple registrations, and of course, the nice champion. He had won, world bench, and he'd won the night world, 3 times, and a couple reserves, but mentality, looks, Joe is a natural bobtail, which always kind of didn't have that short, had that probably natural 4-5 inch tail, and produced, a lot of people, didn't prefer the little that big. To me, gave you something to hold on to, right? Pull him out of a hole with. So it was enough. But yeah, Joe, to me, head, body, was always, that's the type of confirmation that I for sure want in mine. Like I said, it's crazy over the years. I've kind of got where I don't have too much of that bloodline left, and actually took a female a couple weeks ago and bred back to a grand pup of his. But of course, his, to add to that, right, had double dew claws. A lot of people asked me when I named him if he was missing a couple toes, and well, he had extra toes, and he had the set on him was good. Just wasn't the floppy deal. And I know there's always been, that argument whether you keep dew claws or not. I bred for it. Mm-hmm. Like I said, up north, you got a lot of snow and a lot of ice and stuff. We had it here. I hunted up there. People's had some issues with it. I've never had it. And I mean, to me, it's one of the traits of this dog, and, the mountain cur. And I always think they got to breed for the things that are naturally to them. And so, I mean, with anybody that had any breeding of Joe and them, they probably have a dew claws, because I mean, he would definitely produce the dew claws, and produce tons of puppies that confirmation and feeling. To me, like I said, confirmation and breed standard and stuff like that is always kind of what I look for when I breed my dogs. I want a pretty dog, mm-hmm, that can tree, for sure.
Yeah, life's too short to hunt an ugly dog. There's no doubt about that.
Yep. I've had some. So.
What? Do I remember him having a thing about skunks?
So yes, and I mean, when he got older in life, he kind of quit it. But Joe was a skunk killer. Now, if I had dogs that killed skunks like Joe, it still wouldn't bother me, because Joe very rare got sprayed. He didn't mess around, didn't do it, and I mean, he just went in there and chopped them and was done. And but yeah, I mean, that was probably one of the things after when he was probably 2, there wasn't too many of them around here either, because he would definitely, if another dog was with him, I mean, I swore sometimes he grabbed him to spray the other dog with it. But yeah, he definitely, when he was young, but kind of like I said, when he was young, and where my dad, for probably the first couple of years of his life, did not really like him, because it seemed like, like I said, Joe was looking for something to get. I mean, that's how he hunted, and that's how he wanted. And, and it just seemed like when I hunted with my dad, he'd come up and hunt a little bit. And like I said, Joe would, kill something way too far before you get to it. And, in today's world with the Garmin and stuff like that, right, you could just go right to that spot. But back then, especially when it's 400 or 500 yards, you couldn't. But, like I said, skunk goon, I mean, had him, catch a couple bobcats, and I mean, like I said, at the beginning, he was definitely wanting game. And I think a lot of dogs that have that mentality, that's what makes them honest and good, because they're just not wanting to tree, they're wanting the game, and mm-hmm, the dogs that I've had in my life that has been a little bit more gamey than tree minded tend to start out and end a little bit more accurate, because I mean they're just not wanting to tree. I've had dogs over my lifetime too that would rather tree than mess with game. And, some of them turned out really, really great. And other ones, I can't tell you, I was really pleased with them.
Yeah. To back up a little bit, uh, what can you tell us about how you got started with tree dogs, Nick?
So, again, I was luckier than most. Right? My family has been involved with the tree dogs and Ridge Mountain Terrier dogs and Kimmer dogs for a long time. My grandpa and A.D. Ledbetter wrote one of the very first books on them and was involved in it. My parents, Donnie and Mary Clark, has, you know, at the time, raised, and you probably can't hardly find a original mountain cur paper that won't have one of their dogs on it. I mean, and luckily, like I said, for myself, was raised up into it and understood the value of trying to keep this dog, and the breeding program that my parents had, kind of is what I still believe by today. And I am one. I mean, I've had several hound guys over the years, want to crossbreed, and I ain't never bred one. And a lot of times I don't think it's going to improve my breed or their breed. But yeah, like I said, my Uncle Teddy was in it. Like I said, my family's been involved in it a long time. I had the opportunity to meet a lot of great people and have a lot of influence on my, with what I do and the dogs that I went to. And, one of my first original mountain curs that I really started competition on was, Clark's DOG. And, David Carr had the Tennessee Tig at the time and bred him to Calamity Jane. And, like I said, it was kind of my kickstart of the really getting into the competition side and being out more in the public with it.
Hmm. You mentioned your dad. I've got to talk with Donnie a handful of times. He's a I believe whenever we went to Jamestown, I think about that point in time, he was on the OMCBA BOD, if
Yeah.
I remember right. And I believe he told me that he had won Autumn Oaks at one point in life.
Yeah. Yeah. And I don't say, Dad we had the old Walker dog called House's Tom Tom and a couple other, but yeah, I mean, which a lot of people that know me and stuff like that, I've hunted behind about every type of tree dog out there. And I still a lot of times question myself today when I go out with the hound guys why I did it. And everybody's definition of a coon dog is by far different. But I've been around, both, and there's things that I like about all of them and things that I could do without. And the to me, a coon dog, like, to me, Joe, in my definition, was what I wanted. I mean, he would go as far as you would let him go. He was going to treat a coon. If he could hear me, he would come back to me, no matter. And, to me, I didn't have to drive around, go get him. I had to do nothing. And, trust me, there was times that we went further to him and a lot of times we created it ourselves. We'd get to doing something, messing around and whatever. He'd look down and he'd check in twice and left, again. But yeah, I was going to say it's, preferences deal. I mean, you've hunted enough, even in the cur dog, what people, one person considers junk, the other person will consider it to be the best thing ever. And I've tried to keep a truly open mind. And I mean, kind of go back to the breeding program of my parents. They didn't get stuck on a singular thing. They definitely bred to what worked. And again, the Junior Jukebox is probably, to me, one of their staple dogs. But adding the Bonnie Betty to it, and of course, had a lot of streak bred dogs and some Kimmer bred dogs and some butcher, you name it. They just kind of found what worked. And It's kind of like I said, the all around dog is still, and a lot of the biggest things with puppies, right? If you can produce them that it doesn't take a guy that hunts all the time, or just a family person or somebody the first time they get them, that they can have success with them is a little bit easier. And I mean, kind of the world changed, right? Everybody wants that 1 year wonder dog, and a long time ago it just seemed like they were as far and few between. And the Ramblin' Rosie female was for sure probably my first. That just seemed like when they were puppies they'd tree everything. And then I got Super Freak and Joe, and been lucky to hunt behind and handle a ton of dogs in my lifetime. And I mean, we've talked about it over the years where, it's, you're lucky to have one or two super nice dogs. And I've been lucky to have several and handle several. And, I definitely give credit to, my family, what they did with the cur dogs.
Mm-hmm. One story from one of the nights that we hunted, that I've told a few times over the years is, we were hunting there. We had a whole mess of dogs out. We had 8 or 9 dogs out in the woods, and they got on an armadillo race, and that armadillo came bouncing by us like a bowling ball running 90 mile an hour at about waist level. And it's a wonder one of us didn't get taken out by it.
The armadillos, right? That's a story for itself. But I was winning hunt after hunt with Joe everywhere, and it took me like 3 years to win a hunt down in Arkansas with him, because all you do is go down there and shred armadillos, and I remember one guy telling me, he said, you ought to fix that. And I was like, dude, I don't have armadillos, it's like, but it took me probably 3 years down there before he, actually coon hunted instead of armadillo getting.
Yeah. So, what else can you tell me just about what Joe was like as a reproducer?
So, Joe had, several great puppies. Like I said, should have did a lot better job of keeping up with several of them, but, sold a few that I tried to get back and from him. And Tim Freaky out of West Virginia had raised, a handful out of the Freak and Joe cross that did extremely good. I mean, probably one of my favorite crosses with Joe was with the Super Freak. And, I actually have a female that's out of that cross. She's 16, still looks good, and, lightning. And, but, the probably known wise, Joe Money was probably, where, I mean, when you went to Jamestown with us, right, we took him.
I think he was just 6 or 7 months old then.
Yeah. And the funniest story, again, talking about wishing you had cameras and with video and stuff like that. You remember the dash race with him?
Mm-hmm.
You remember that? Turned him loose and he shot off like a rocket, and then the other dogs kind of was beside of him. His eyes got real big and jumped up in the air, jumped on the back of one dog, kicked off, and jumped all the way across the pile, and spun around and looked at us with big old bug eyes like, what was that? But, again, talking about a pup that, started quick and fast out of, I mean, Joe Money was by far that dog, right? I mean, at that time was placing in some big hunts with him. And, at 6 months old, went to the national hunt up North Iowa and got third and squirrel hunt, third and coon hunt. Then took him to Elnora, the month after that, and placed in the top 5 with him, both day and night with him there. And like I said, he was a quick starter. He reminded me a lot of Joe, except it's a small version, right? Joe Money wasn't the size of Joe, and the other male, the littermate to him, Ruger, which, Ruger won a couple world champions and stuff, but Ruger was kind of more Joe's size, and he was a dark brindle and really super nice dog. And Joe Money kind of was a shorter loop dog, and I wanted, kind of like I said, would grind them tracks out and stuff, but treat a ton of coon. I'm in with Ruger and Joe Money the first year that we hunted them two, which would have been, they'd have probably been 10, 11 months old. We 238 coon with them two. And I mean, they were super, but that cross for sure, day or night, it didn't matter. Some of the ones that I kept over the years myself that, I hunted in some of the hunts, and later was a dog called Ringo, and then I had one that Clark's Buck, and then Josie was another one. But he produced, like I said, should have probably kept better track of a lot of them, but there were several of them. I'd sold to a guy that competition hunt a couple pups out of him, and I'd go down and hunt with him some, and that's all he hunted. I mean, they were super nice, super. And I asked him, I said, why don't you ever take him? And he honestly just told me, he said, I'm not representing your bloodline. I mean, they were good enough that they should have been out and winning, which I tried to buy the male dog later on off of him. He wasn't selling, but like I said, I hopefully will get a little bit of that back. I have a female called Trixie, which goes back to Banner. She's a Banner puppy. She's 5 and has some Bonnie Betty and some breeding and stuff. But then I bred her to a grandpup of Two-Toed Joe called Rock, and which is Joe Money and Lightning, puppy, which the Two-Toed Joe super freak. So hopefully with it, the paper on this will have a whole lot of stuff in it that we used to really have and push. And like I said, I'm hoping to get some of that back and, be dog poor again after many.
I know that feeling. Well, as we're getting close to being out of time, what do you feel like Joe's biggest strengths and weaknesses were?
So, its strength was by far, it wasn't going to matter where you turned him out or when you turned him out, he was going to treat him. Everybody that hunted with him, and, like I said, you hate bragging up a dog and stuff like that, but the consistency of him was, if other dogs couldn't tree him, he was going to tree him. Whether there was frost on the ground, it was full moon, there was snow, it was pouring rain. Like I said, he was going to go find a coon and tree it. And the accuracy and the handling was a plus with him. Again, and for me, it's not a weakness, but definitely the weakness was his tree style. And the reason I would only say it's weakness because that was the thing that, when you hunted with the hound guides and stuff, he could tree all the coon and all they couldn't get over it. But I still, in my personal opinion, I actually felt like that it gave him a little extra, especially if he was hunting long and deal. Mm-hmm. To kind of further how much, when you hunted with people. So one of my friends had a friend that had hounds that wanted to buy it was one of the Joe and Freak puppies. So he called when he was ready and asked if we'd take it down there, because he wanted to see how these, cur dogs work. And I said, yeah, we can do that. And so I took Joe down there, and the buck pup that I talked about earlier, they were probably 9, 10 months old. And Jake had a younger dog that, they weren't doing nothing great, but they were doing enough that really you like taking them to the woods. And we went to his first spot, and we was getting ready to dump out. And he told us, he said, well, I've been here for 14 years and we've never treated coon on the outside in this place. And I kind of looked at him like, well, why are we, if you want to see what's going on, why are we here? Right. Mm-hmm. I turned Joe loose and we got walking and telling stories and stuff. And probably 15 minutes later, Joe treed probably 400 or 500 yards from us. We walked to him, coon on the outside. I kicked him loose again in a little bit. He was probably 600-700 yards treed. And the two pups we had, they'd go in, tree with him a little bit, come back, run around, let's go up to the tree. And on our way to him, they had found a possum that was probably 10 foot up in tree, and they were treeing and jumping, and I knocked it out, and they were playing with it. And then we finished that, and we walked on, and Joe had another coon. So he told us, he said, well, I got one more spot I want to take you. So we go to this spot, and he said that they've never ever made a tree at this spot. And I'm like, what are we doing? And so we kicked him loose, which I told him, I said, that was the difference between Joe. Joe was going to go to get a coon. And he probably went half mile in treed. And pups had found another possum. We played with this for a little bit. Then we went on to Joe. And it was just probably 10, 12 trees out in the middle of a pasture that was way back there. When he's walking across that pasture, the pups would run 400 or 500 yards up there, bark with him a handful of times, then they'd come flying back, right? And they kind of did this all the way till we got to Joe. They came back 4 or 5 times to go tree with him, and he had a couple coon in the tree there. So once we got walking back, Jake asked him, he said, what do you think of the cur dog? And he goes, I'm not impressed at all. That old dog doesn't bark real hard, and them pups, all they did was nest possums and go tree and quit treeing and go tree. And I looked at him and said, you took us to a spot in 15 years you've never seen a coon, and there's nothing that impresses you. And he was like, no. He said that dog doesn't tree hard, Dad. And I was like, and I remember this day, we got back to the truck and put dogs in the box, closed my gate, and he was like, hey, you gonna give me my pup? And I said, dude, you don't have enough money to own a pup for me. And I still believe that today. But a lot of it, like I said, was because how he didn't bark 100 barks a minute, right? And to me, to have a dog that can go find a coon where you've never been able to find one should impress you a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, Nick, I sure appreciate you giving us some of your time and coming on here and letting me interview you for this.
Nope, I definitely appreciate it. And like I said, Joe was by far a good one. And, time goes by quickly, and you always try to spend a long time replacing dogs like that, and you just can't.
Mm-hmm. Yep, it's hard. Well, everybody, keep wearing out that boot leather. I just want to give everyone that's listening a sincere thank you. Getting this podcast going has been a project. I really hope you're enjoying it, and if you don't mind, give the show a good rating and review wherever you're listening to it at, or share it on your social media to help get some traction. I appreciate it, and I'm looking forward to your feedback.